The early hours of the 1st of June, 2009. Air France Flight 447 from Rio de Janeiro to Paris makes its final radio transmission. Then, all contact is lost. Flight 447 has vanished into thin air.
We can only pray and hope. At the moment, we know nothing.
Aviation experts are baffled.
Why would a well-operated aircraft with a well-trained crew suddenly disappear?
The thing that we know is that we don't know.
The missing aircraft is a state-of-the-art Airbus A330. It has never suffered a single passenger fatality.
The big question, of course, is where is the aircraft?
5 days later, the shattered wreckage is finally discovered, floating in the Atlantic. 228 passengers and crew are dead. No one has given a full explanation as to what happened. Until now. One year after Flight 447 was lost, a €28 million Atlantic search operation has failed to recover the all-important black boxes. The missing flight data and cockpit voice recorders would provide the only definitive proof of the aircraft's fate.
These have not been found yet. They're clearly on the bottom with the rest of the wreckage. A very, very big handicap to the investigation.
The official French investigation is not prepared to make its final report until the black boxes are found. 2 interim reports set out a tantalizing array of known facts, but are unwilling to draw specific conclusions. With nearly 700 A330s in service worldwide, passenger safety experts are impatient for answers.
We move basically the population of the planet every 3 years. We just can't accept unknowns any longer.
This film brings together an independent team of leading air crash investigators. Their combined expertise will provide the first credible solution to the mystery of Flight 447. With their own tests and simulations, they plan to piece together a convincing accident scenario from the few clues scattered in the official reports. Veteran crash investigator Tony Cable will build a case from just a few fragments of evidence.
Any accident is a chain of events, and each of the links needs to be in place.
He will be joined by an aviation meteorologist.
We really are limited to using mostly satellite data to understand what's going on.
And a highly respected structural engineer.
You're going to be forced to just look at whatever recovered pieces of the structure that you have.
Completing the team, 3 expert pilots specializing in aviation safety.
It's very unlikely that one single thing would bring down an aircraft.
There's an unfortunate alignment of many things that caused a problem.
As you piece it together, the weight and significance of each piece of that evidence becomes more and more clear. And that's how you develop the theory that leads to the truth.
The investigation team faces a daunting challenge. The lost aircraft left hardly a trace behind. Tony Cable is a veteran of 32 years in the UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch. He was a senior investigator on the Concorde crash and the Lockerbie bombing. As he kickstarts our independent investigation, he knows physical evidence is limited.
The normal way of investigating an accident, of course, is to look at the crash site and the wreckage. In this case, it's likely there's only a small amount of floating wreckage.
5 days after it disappeared, the first wreckage from Flight 447 was found, floating 750 miles off the coast of Brazil. But most of the aircraft had sunk 2.5 miles down to the ocean floor. Tony Cable's task, to somehow make sense of the few fragments that were recovered.
It is possible, if you know the wreckage, to work out quite a lot about how it crashed, whether it broke up in the air.
The first thing to eliminate, the possibility of a terrorist attack.
The possibilities that immediately come to mind would be a bomb or a structural breakup.
In the hunt for evidence of a mid-air explosion and breakup, Cable is joined by one of the world's leading aviation safety consultants. For John Cox, the key technique is reconstruction.
Dealing with wreckage is literally a jigsaw puzzle, but you don't know how many pieces you have, and you usually don't have all of them. Are both wings attached to the airplane? Is the nose there? Is the tail there? The, quote, four corners. You have to take what wreckage you have and reassemble it so that you can then begin to understand the forces that were actually on the airplane at impact in its last moments of flight.
A similar jigsaw puzzle was solved in this way when TWA Flight 800 crashed off the coast of New York in 1996. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air, then large fragments of fuselage floated slowly down to the water without further major damage. The National Transportation Safety Board were able to conclude that a fuel explosion due to faulty wiring was the cause. Engineer Jim Wildey was chief of the investigation's materials lab. But with Flight 447, he faces a jigsaw with most of the pieces missing.
In this case, there's only a limited amount of structure that's recovered. It fortunately does tell enough of a story to at least give a clue as to what's going on with the airplane.
2 of Flight 447's 4 corners were recovered. Wildey turns first to the nose cone.
If this piece was to come off the airplane and float to the water by itself, it wouldn't be going fast enough so that when it hit the water, it would be damaged really in any way.
Instead, the nose cone shows signs of a high-speed impact with the water.
What we see here is that this piece has been flattened, it's been crushed, it's been torn, and so this is a very clear sign that this piece was on the airplane when the airplane hit the water.
It looks like the nose cone only broke off on impact. The second jigsaw piece, the tail fin, tells the same story. The official report suggests a mid-air breakup could not have wrenched it from the fuselage like this. Only a massive impact when the aircraft hit the ocean would have sufficient force. Nose cone and tail fin suggest Flight 447 stayed intact until it hit the water. The last piece of the puzzle, a floor section from the cargo compartment, can even tell Wildey which way the aircraft was pointing as it fell.
And what we see here is curvature damage on both sides of this piece with a fracture down the middle. This damage is consistent with the airplane hitting relatively flat and with very high hydraulic pressure coming up from
fly-by-wire. The design philosophy that safety is greatly enhanced by automation.
They're highly automated, they're fly-by-wire, they're some of the leading-edge technology in aviation even today.
If the pilot were to lose control for some reason, the fly-by-wire system would save the aeroplane.
V1, rotate.
Captain Martin Alder is a former chairman of the British Airline Pilots Flight Safety Group.
Gear up.
And a highly experienced Airbus instructor. In the flight simulator, he shows how automation can keep an aircraft under control, even with no help at all from the pilot.
In a conventional aeroplane, instead of this side stick, I'd have quite a big control column here. You need plenty of leverage to apply the mechanical forces you need to move the control surfaces to control the aeroplane.
In a conventional aeroplane, the pilot pulls mechanical levers to operate a powered hydraulic control system. But with fly-by-wire, the heavyweight gear is replaced by electronics. Now a flight computer carries out the pilot's wishes. The computer keeps the aircraft under precision control during any maneuver, even a simple turn.
So if I want to go to the left, stick to the left. Round to the left.
The flight computer adjusts the wing and the aircraft rolls to the left. Ordinarily, this would cause the A330 to descend. So the computer compensates by increasing engine thrust and pitching the nose up to maintain a steady altitude. The end result? Totally automatic control.
I take my hands off, and there we are. It's flying round. Vertical speed 0, 25 degrees of bank, 240 knots. It's going to fly around at 25 degrees of bank. Keep doing this until we get bored.
When autopilot is switched on, the plane literally flies itself.
99% of the time, when you're sitting as a passenger flying at 35,000 feet, the autopilot's flying the aeroplane.
Flight 447 would have been safely on autopilot as it headed out over the Atlantic. The pilots settling in for the long haul. The aircraft making continuous automatic adjustments to keep them on course for Paris. Tony Cable tracks their progress using air traffic control transcripts.
The only thing to go on in this case, in the early stage, is to look at the last position report, which in this case is the last crew conversation with air traffic control.
3 hours out from Rio de Janeiro, Flight 447 was still on the intended flight path.
Air France 447, by checking Intel 0133, level 350, Saupu 0148.
But at 1:35 a.m., all radio communications ceased.
There is nothing to say what's happened to it after that last position report.
The last known position, 350 miles off the coast of Brazil. But now, the mystery deepens. For another 35 minutes, Flight 447's computer continues to send out automatic position reports by satellite.
The reason for the automatic position reports is so that the operator can follow the progress of the flight and know whether it's going to be early or late, to help with its scheduling effectively.
Cable uses the automatic reports to track the flight's further progress. The last location was at 2:10 a.m., 70 miles from where the wreckage was discovered.
What these messages do show is a last automatic position report and then apparently the end of the flight.
Something in Flight 447's path brought it down. Cable hunts for the cause in the official weather report.
There was thunderstorm activity in that area, quite a large trail across the flight path at the time that AF447 went through.
At 2:10 a.m., Flight 447 was in the vicinity of an Atlantic thunderstorm, 250 miles wide. But this fact raises a crucial question that the official reports fail to answer. Why would experienced pilots fly into a storm?
The idea that a pilot would fly through a thunderstorm, absolutely not.
Highly improbable. Pilots, remember, at the front end of the airplane, the first people to meet any accident. We have a great incentive not to meet accidents.
Flight 447 must have flown into the storm by mistake. To find out why this happened, the investigation turns to John Williams, a specialist in aviation meteorology at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Williams has satellite images taken every half hour to analyze how the storm developed as Flight 447 approached.
I'll step through by 30-minute intervals, and you'll see these storm systems starting to grow. This storm system is hundreds of miles across and maybe 60 miles wide. Wow, look at the size of that growth right there.
In daylight, the thunderclouds would have spanned the horizon, towering from the ocean to 50,000 feet. But in the dark early hours of the morning, the Flight 447 pilots can't see them. Instead, they must rely on their onboard weather radar. Radar waves reflect from water droplets in the clouds, allowing pilots to pick their way around any dangerous storms. According to the official reports, several other flights that night took the same route as Flight 447. But all these pilots saw the storm coming and made detours of up to 90 miles to avoid it. But Flight 447 made only a minor change of course.
You can see that it had deviated a little bit off of its flight plan, and that might mean that they were trying to deviate around some storms.
This minor deviation leads Williams to a major breakthrough. He thinks Flight 447 was deceived by a quirk of the weather.
What you can see is that there's a small storm between them and the
move. As turbulence hits, sudden updrafts throw the aircraft up and down. But autothrust changes the engine power to compensate, maintaining the aircraft in a safe speed range. All the pilots have to do is monitor the instruments.
The systems automatically will tell you if they get out of limits, but you could be looking at the systems from time to time just to check that they are well inside limits.
The investigation has traced Flight 447's progress to its last known position. They're in the midst of a rapidly developing storm that their radar detected too late. The pilots have no option but to ride out the turbulence. But their automatic systems provide reassuring protection. It's 2:10 a.m. The evidence suggests that little more than 4 minutes later, everyone on board Flight 447 was dead. Automation gives the investigators a crucial window on what happened next. Just after 2:10 a.m., the flight computer suddenly sent a torrent of fault messages to Air France in Paris. These so-called ACARS messages now form the central focus of the investigation.
It really is the last will and testament of the aircraft.
Flight 447 suffered 24 critical faults in just 4 minutes and 16 seconds.
You can just see an aircraft almost dying in front of you.
The tantalizing cryptic messages are the only evidence that can cast light on Flight 447's final moments.
As the last message from the aircraft, they may well tell a very great deal about what happened.
Tony Cable decodes the data to reconstruct events on a second-by-second basis.
The first ACARS message that appears is autopilot off, and that indicates that the autopilot has disengaged on its own. There is a master audio warning, which is a real attention getter.
With no airspeed data, Flight 447's automatic systems collapse. One by one by one. In total darkness and heavy turbulence, the crew are forced to retake manual control.
Pilots are the last line of defense. So when things go very wrong, the last line of defense is the aviator.
After more than 3 hours on autopilot, the pilots are suddenly faced by information overload.
That crew faced an almost unheard of series of failures, one right behind the other. And for them to sort through it would have been very difficult that night. Why is the airplane doing what it's doing? What are all these failures? Why are they all coming at one time?
Bombarded by faults, the pilot must cope with the most serious problem of all. He must maintain speed, or they will go out of control.
The acceleration of forces caused by the turbulence means that we might stall the aircraft.
If Flight 447 slows down by just a few knots, it could go into the catastrophic condition known as a stall. Back in the wind tunnel, Tony Cable demonstrates how an aircraft's wing can cease to function.
Okay, Cliff, you ready to go?
An aircraft is kept aloft by smooth, streamlined airflow over the wings. If the aircraft slows down, the angle of the wing must be increased to maintain lift. But too slow, and there's a critical angle where the airflow breaks up.
If you disrupt that flow, the wing cannot produce lift. And that's really all a stall is it's a disruption of the airflow across the top of the wing.
If it slows down, there's a tendency for the nose to come up, and at a fairly shallow angle, the wings will stall, the airflow breaks down, there's a lot of lift, and the aircraft begins to descend.
Stalled wings would mean a dramatic, uncontrolled descent. At 35,000 feet, in heavy turbulence, even a very small reduction in speed would increase the risk.
Our speed range is quite limited. Typically it could be 10 knots either side of the cruise speed.
The pilots must somehow avoid slowing down by even 10 knots. The only trouble is, with their pitot probes frozen, they have no way of knowing how fast they're going.
The ability for the crew to recognize if they were at the proper speed is going to be a much more complex problem now.
A complex problem, but can it be solved? In the simulator, Martin Alder plans to recreate the known technical failures on Flight 447. Two experienced pilot instructors will attempt to maintain speed and avoid the stall using standard operating procedure.
Could you give Brest a call, see if there are any ride reports so far?
Like Flight 447, they are cruising normally at 35,000 feet at night over the ocean.
Okay, there's no changes.
Alder triggers the storm.
I like the look of that one, so now activating.
Thunderclouds loom ahead on the pilot's radar.
Probably in a line of thunderstorms.
The captain plans a detour and prepares for turbulence.
So turbulence airspeed, then I'm selecting decimal 76.
As was likely on Flight 447, the pilot selects a slightly lower speed to reduce stresses on the aircraft. Auto thrust automatically reduces engine power.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, the captain speaking. We are just approaching an area where there are a few rain showers around. We've put the seatbelt sign on for approximately 10 minutes or so.
As they edge around the storm, Alder triggers the critical moment of Flight 447. He fails the airspeed indicators.
Okay, we have a nav 80 ADR1 fault, and we have unreliable airspeed.
The automatic systems shut down.
We're flying no autopilot or autothrust.
Okay, autopilot's on. Control.
You have control.
If their airspeed drops by as little as 10 knots, they could stall and fall out of the sky. But the captain relies on established standard procedure. He pushes the throttle levers to set thrust at exactly 85%.
And I'm selecting, I've got 85% set.
Then he raises the elevators to pitch the nose up at precisely 5 degrees. With 85% power and 5 degrees pitch up, they should always settle at the same safe speed.
It's quite possible to fly the aircraft to actually quite high standards of accuracy. Something in the region of about 5 knots or so of the desired target speed would be quite achievable for most crews.
To get radar contact in the next 40 nautical miles.
Pitch and power is the pilot's lifeline. They ignore any fault messages until they're safely in control.
Got 5 degrees on the standby, 4 degrees one way or the other.
Flying the aeroplane is the prime objective. No matter how attractive the messages might be to anything on the flight deck, you both concentrate on ensuring that the person who should be flying the aeroplane is flying it and flying it in the manner which is safe.
Okay, so we've got what I think is basic control of the attitude. We're bumping a little bit with the weather, but generally that's safe.
Maintaining pitch and power will get them to the nearest airport.
Well, we had a...
The storm has passed. The emergency is over.
That's it. Finished.
Martin Alder's simulation shows that speed can be maintained even if all 3 pitot probes fail. But was this standard pitch and power technique applied by the crew of Flight 447? And why didn't they recover control? The official reports have no direct evidence. But former Airbus pilot John Cox identifies a crucial detail in the standard procedures.
If they were just entering an area of choppy air, they may very well have been slowing the airplane down.
When Flight 447 first entered the storm, they would reduce speed. So autothrust decreases engine power automatically. But it does not give the pilots an important visual signal.
The thrust levers themselves, the throttles, don't move, unlike some other airplanes where you can feel the throttle in your hand moving. With Airbus aircraft, that throttle doesn't move with autothrust engaged, so you have to look at specific engine power indications.
The power indications are displayed here on the central control panel. But in John Cox's scenario, the pilot doesn't notice it.
If you're very task saturated, your concentration is going to be directly in front of you. What's the power output of the engines? You're going to have to physically turn your attention and look to the center console area. This is not going to be done as frequently as looking at the things right in front of you. It's certainly going to be in the scan. The question is how often.
Overloaded by fault warnings, the pilot overlooks the low power indication.
Was this crew one that was very attentive and picked up this information very early? Were they very slow to pick up the information? We don't know. Were the demands so high that they were unable to keep up with it? We don't know.
Only Flight 447's black boxes could provide conclusive evidence. But now Tony Cable discovers a worrying pattern to support Cox's theory. In 10 previous incidents of airspeed failure, the crews failed to increase thrust immediately.
In quite a number of them, it's clear that the crews were very slow to get onto manual throttle operation.
In 5 cases, crews did not take manual control of thrust for more than 60 seconds. For Flight 447, that would spell rapid deceleration and the risk of a sudden stall.
10 to 15 knots would not be unusual. If you decelerate at a knot a second, it's 15 seconds. The aircraft could slow down to a much lower speed, and you could approach the stall quite quickly in that manner at altitude.
There is a good possibility that at some point in the last 4 minutes that there was a stall event.
A sudden and critical loss of lift from the wings. But even in a stall, the aircraft can be saved. Tony Cable explains the standard recovery technique.
The procedure is full thrust on both engines, reduce the pitch attitude, and the aircraft will then resume normal flight.
By pitching the nose down, the pilot restores smooth airflow over the wings and escapes the stall. But Flight 447's pilots may have found themselves in totally unknown territory.
If they were in a condition that it fully stalled, oftentimes when the nose breaks, they'll roll off on a wing. And that's a pretty aggressive maneuver when the airplane does that.
If one wing stalls before the other, the aircraft rolls violently to one side, more like a fighter jet than a passenger airliner. To recover from this stall, the Flight 447 pilot would require highly specialized skills. This is the National Aerospace Training and Research Center in Pennsylvania. At the controls of his advanced simulator is Colonel Paul Comtois, a former U.S. Air Force F-16 fighter pilot. He believes that taking an aircraft to the extremes is a skill that only comes from direct experience.
We don't fly around autopilot a lot. We have a lot of, hands-on stick time. Not only does it give you the experience to fly in that extreme maneuvering envelope, it gives you the confidence to be able to do it as well.
The simulator has the cockpit controls of a passenger airliner. But unlike conventional simulators, it moves like a fighter jet, spinning on 3 axes to take pilots to the limits of human physiology.
You learn not to believe your body, because your body will lie to you.
Comtois is flying in the dark, with no visual cues from the outside world. Instead, he must rely on his instruments.
I have flown on missions where I felt like I was in 120 degrees of bank, but I'm looking at that gauge and it's telling me I'm flying straight and level.
Instructor Glenn King is about to trigger a violent maneuver, like the stall that may have hit Flight 447.
Here comes a very high 4-degree pitch up, 50-degree pitch up attitude. The aircraft is rolling.
The simulator sends Comtois into a head-spinning roll at 35,000 feet.
You gotta unstall the airplane. The nose must go down.
He has to get the air flowing over his wings by ignoring his own senses and trusting the instruments.
It's a mental battle because, yes, I am flying on that gauge, but man, I don't feel right.
He's regaining control, but the ground is coming up fast.
I've got to be very careful for how much I pull back on that stick.
The danger? He might stall again as he tries to pull up.
Okay, you started his recovery you can hear the buffeting now from the plane being loaded.
You can see how fast it is.
Now, the aircraft's starting to G-load, starting to load up the G's. The airspeed's very high. Recover, Paul. That's a lot of altitude. And he's flying again.
Comtois finally recovers control, but despite years of jet fighter experience, the Air Force colonel lost 19,000 feet, more than half his altitude in just 45 seconds. Most airline pilots have no such experience, and autopilot means they do little hands-on flying. For Tony Cable, the case of Flight 447 highlights critical training issues.
It has raised the question about whether the situation is actually being made worse by the increase in automation, whereby crews don't get a great deal of opportunity to manually fly the aircraft.
Paul Comtois agrees.
The more we automate, the more we need to get back to the basics of flying. You know, when I'm flying that fighter to the edges, I am physically hands-on the stick and throttle.
Standard airline flight simulators don't have the freedom of movement to recreate extreme maneuvers.
Stalling is not something actually that's taught to transport category aeroplane pilots. We've gone from pilots who've had experience of some of the more extreme maneuvers to pilots who very rarely see them.
But the wreckage of Flight 447 suggests the pilots may have come close to saving their passengers' lives.
We know that based on the impact damage that the airplane was nose up pretty close to wings level with a high vertical sink rate when it hit the water.
Did they somehow manage to get upright and level before running out of time? Without further evidence, this is one question the investigators can't answer. A year after the accident, the search for Flight 447's black boxes continues. This is what the official investigation is looking for. But Flight 4